Okay, it's after 1 o'clock, so we'll get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Communities Study Learning Collaborative. My name is Lisa Romley, and I'm the Educational Program Coordinator for the HEAL study. Just a few reminders before we get started that this session is being recorded today, and we are offering 1 CE credit that has been approved for physician, pharmacists, nurses, social worker, and alcohol and drug counselors. And at the end of the session, I will be providing instructions on how to get that CE credits. We ask that you stay muted throughout this presentation, and that will help reduce any of the extraneous noises in the room. If you have questions, and we do welcome your questions, we ask that you use the raise hand feature, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you click on reaction and then click on raised hand, or you can send your questions privately to Dr. Carrie Oser, or just place them in the chat and we'll read them from there. But just FYI, we will wait until after the presentation when we get to the roundtable discussion to address those questions and read them. Just a reminder that information obtained during the session is not, nor is it intended to be, legal advice. The communication does not create an attorney-client relationship. With individual situations, it is recommended that an individual consults with an attorney for advice. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Dr. Carrie Oser, who is on the UK HEAL team. She's the faculty lead for the criminal justice team.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for organizing this event today. As Lisa mentioned, my name is Carrie Oser. I'm a faculty member at the University of Kentucky in the sociology department, and I'm a co-investigator on the Healing Community Study leading the criminal justice team's initiatives. And so I see lots of familiar justice partners faces on the Learning Collaborative today. So welcome, and welcome new folks. We're glad you're here. We have a really exciting list of panelists, and I would like to introduce them. First off, we have Monica Roberts, who is an academic detailing pharmacist with the Healing Community Study. And to tell you a little bit about Monica, before she joined the UK HEAL team, she practiced in community pharmacy, and she completed her residency training with UK and Kroger Pharmacy. She's certified to initiate the dispensing of naloxone. And in addition to her PharmD in UK, she also holds a BA in newspaper journalism and a psychology degree from Syracuse University. So very diverse background. We're also pleased to have Chris Nordloh here today. And Chris Nordloh is the assistant Kenton County attorney. He's dedicated over 25 years as a practicing attorney to represent individuals and government officials within the federal and state courts, with a focus on litigation, trial, and appellate practice as lead counsel. Chris is a graduate of Thomas More College. He received his JD degree from Salmon P. Chase College of Law, and he's licensed with the Kentucky and Ohio Bar Association. And last, but certainly not least, we have Major Kyle Barrett. Major Kyle Barrett is the director of the Madison County Home Incarceration Program. And Kyle has been employed in public safety for over 16 years. Major Barrett has held positions, the positions of deputy jailer and lieutenant prior to being promoted to the rank of major in 2020. So I'm glad that all 3 panelists are here. And before we have a bit of a presentation, but before we launch into that, I would like to ask each of our panelists, how have you been involved in the Healing Community Study? So we have a little bit of background and context about how these 3 individuals are involved in the Healing Community Study. Monica, would you mind to start?
Sure, thanks, Carrie. So I, as Carrie mentioned, I'm an academic detailing pharmacist with the Healing Community Study. Which is basically a fancy way to say that I provide education to healthcare professionals, pharmacists, the public, pretty much anybody I can get my hands on safer opioid prescribing, opioid safety, and naloxone. So I'm a staff member here with the Healing Community Study, and I'm excited to be here to talk about naloxone with you all today.
Thank you, Monica. And Chris, would you mind to explain how you've been involved in the Healing Community Study?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm an assistant county attorney, as previously introduced, and one of my principal responsibilities is to advise and represent the Kenton County Detention Center and its officials. And I was asked earlier this year to review the Healing Initiative agreement and to just help clarify and refine the detention center's role as an agency partner with the University of Kentucky.
Wonderful, thank you. And Major Barrett?
Roughly 2019, 2020, especially at the beginning before COVID hit, we had partnered with our health department, and they had said that UK was possibly going to be getting a grant. So we quickly decided to get on board as quickly as possible. We joined we partnered with UK, and they have since partnered us with Voices of Hope, who now provide services within our detention center.
Thank you. And I know that individuals have submitted questions, so we have some of those questions that we will ask our panelists. But let me ask Monica to start with an introduction about naloxone.
Sure. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and we'll just do kind of a short presentation on naloxone bystander basics. So as we've mentioned, I'm a pharmacist. I don't have a background in law or law enforcement, so I won't try to address many of those issues. My background is in community pharmacy, so if you have any questions or things that you're curious about, feel free to throw them in the chat or interrupt me. There is almost nothing crazier than the things I heard when I was standing behind the pharmacy counter at Kroger. So you can't surprise me or throw me off with any of your questions today. I do not have any financial relationships to disclose. My position is fully funded by the National Institutes of Health. However, I do not speak for the National Institutes of Health or for any element of the federal government. Sure, my slides are going here. Okay. This is just some required continuing education information. These are the objectives of this short presentation, but really the goal is just to establish kind of a baseline knowledge and understanding about naloxone so that we can have a really rich and informed discussion about naloxone distribution in criminal justice settings. Make sure we're kind of all on the same page. So with that, we'll jump right in. I wanted to start with what's in a name. This is a question we get a lot in pharmacy and kind of a lot with naloxone. I say naloxone, people say Narcan. Everybody wants to know what's the difference, what's that all about? And this gives me a chance to provide a little bit of background on naloxone as well and sort of how we got to where we are today. So in 1971, the FDA approved the first naloxone product, which was brand name Narcan. Kind of like tissues and Kleenex, Narcan quickly became the name we used for all naloxone. This product was an injectable naloxone. It was primarily used in hospitals and by paramedics, and came in these little ampules or just normal vials. As the years went on, Narcan lost its patent protection and people started making generic naloxone that was pretty cheap. And in the 90s, harm reduction programs started to say, we've got this thing that we know reverses opioid overdoses. Why don't we make it available to bystanders so that they can reverse an opioid overdose in the time it takes for emergency services to get there? They wanted people in the community of people who use drugs to be able to help themselves when an overdose happened. So in the mid to late 90s, this kind of started to pick up steam where they would distribute just these vials, just like they would use in the hospital, with either syringes or kits to help use it nasally. And it was just kind of an off-label, unregulated distribution of injectable naloxone. As the opioid epidemic got worse and these harm reduction programs kind of got bigger and bigger, the drug companies saw an opportunity and said, well, why don't we make a product that is intended for bystander use? So simple to use, any lay person can reverse an opioid overdose. And so in 2014, the first of those products hit the market, and it was called Evzio. And this was also injectable naloxone, but it was in a device kind of like an EpiPen, where all you had to do was kind of press it up against the person's muscle and it would automatically inject the dose. Hot on its heels in 2015, the FDA approved Narcan nasal spray. So this kind of brought that Narcan name back and was an easy to use nasal spray form of naloxone. So one-time use, all ready to go in this nice little nasal spray. This product, Narcan nasal spray, quickly became the most popular for use by harm reduction programs and health departments and even EMS services in a lot of places. So Narcan nasal spray quickly kind of took over the market. In 2020, Evzio stopped trying to make money on this very expensive naloxone product and stopped manufacturing it. So these Evzio products are still around. If you have them or you find a closet full of them in a government agency somewhere, these are still good to use until they expire, but they're not manufacturing them anymore. So it's going to be hard to buy them very soon. To further confuse things, in 2021, just this past spring, the FDA approved a product called Kloxxado. And you'll notice that this one looks a lot like Narcan nasal spray, and it's almost exactly the same, except it's a different dose of naloxone. So we won't talk about all the details of that, but we are expecting Kloxxado to be available in August or September, so very, very soon. And you'll likely start seeing these out and about, just like you see Narcan nasal spray. The important thing with all of these products is they are all naloxone. It's the same drug. It works the same way in the body. It's just delivered differently or packaged differently. So let's talk about how naloxone works to reverse an opioid overdose. First thing we need to know is what drugs are opioids. And you can see here some common prescription opioids up at the top. You probably recognize a lot of these names. This is not all the opioids that are available, but these are the most frequently used ones. And then common illicit opioids like heroin down at the bottom. And you'll notice that we've got fentanyl on here twice. And I did that intentionally because illicit fentanyl and prescription fentanyl, while they're the same drug, they're kind of two different things. The fentanyl that we are seeing today that is driving a lot of our opioid overdose deaths right now is coming out of an illicit drug supply that is manufactured illicitly. This isn't like OxyContin of old, where people were getting prescriptions for it and diverting it into an illicit market. This is showing up in our drug supply all the way back to the illicit manufacturers. And so that is important in a naloxone discussion because the fentanyl we're seeing in our drug supply is an unknown purity, an unknown potency, and is showing up in places that we would not expect it to show up. So we have people using fentanyl, people being exposed to fentanyl when they think they're taking another opioid like heroin or OxyContin. We also have people who think they're taking another drug and are getting fentanyl mixed in. So it's shown up with methamphetamine overdoses, cocaine, even marijuana. We're seeing people being exposed to fentanyl. There's a lot of debate about whether that's intentional or unintentional. That is not important. The important thing here is if it looks and acts like an opioid overdose, we want to treat it with naloxone, just like it's an opioid overdose, because there's a possibility that the person has been exposed to fentanyl. So what does an opioid overdose look like and how does it happen? To understand this, we want to understand that opioid molecules are designed to fit into an opioid receptor that's in everybody's bodies. When these little molecules fit in, they activate and turn on the receptor, and that causes a cascade of expected effects. So depending on how many receptors are activated and kind of what drugs we're using, we're going to see pain relief, probably maybe some euphoria, definitely some slowed breathing, possibly some sleepiness, dizziness, confusion, and then some side effects like constipation, itching, urinary retention. These are all things that activating that opioid receptor are going to do as a result of the effects that the opioid receptor has. If too many opioid receptors are activated all at the same time, we get those effects kind of extended out to the point where they become life-threatening. So you go from dizziness and drowsiness to complete unresponsiveness. The person's unable to wake up, and they're unable to be aroused by even a painful stimulus. The slowed breathing progresses all the way to this infrequent, shallow breathing that doesn't provide enough oxygen to keep the person alive. So you'll see people's fingernails and lips start to turn blue or gray. That's a sign they're not getting enough oxygen. As that progresses, eventually the blood pressure and the heart rate start to drop. The person is going to slip into a coma, and eventually they're going to die unless we do something to get those receptors deactivated. The cool thing is that we have naloxone, and I hope this slide doesn't bring back anybody nightmares from chemistry class, but I just show it to point out that naloxone looks enough like an opioid that it can sit in the receptor, but it's just different enough that it can't turn the receptor on. So that little difference means that what it does is it knocks an opioid out of the receptor, and then it just sits in the receptor and essentially turns the receptor off. So it's almost like sticking the wrong key into a lock, right? You put the key in, nothing else can get in there, but you can't open the knob. You can't activate that receptor and cause all those effects. So we call this an opioid antagonist. It's neat because it actually knocks the opioid out of the receptor. The receptor prefers naloxone to the opioid. It's also amazing because it's incredibly safe. It doesn't actually have any effect in the body intrinsically. So if somebody hasn't taken any opioids, if you gave me a whopping dose of naloxone right now, it would just go sit on my already deactivated receptors and do nothing. It would have no effect. So this makes it very safe for when we don't know what might have happened. You see somebody down, looks like an opioid overdose, but we don't know. Maybe they're, diabetic and they've had too much insulin. We can give naloxone and it's not going to harm the person if it's not an opioid overdose. Not going to spend a lot of time on overdose response because hopefully you already have some naloxone, or if not, you're going to run out and get some naloxone and they're going to give you the full training on how to respond to an overdose. But these are the key steps. You want to call 911, administer naloxone every 2 to 3 minutes until the person responds. Stick around, stay with the person, make sure they're okay. Give rescue breaths if you know how to do that. And if you absolutely have to leave for whatever reason, put the person on their side in their recovery position. Administering naloxone, when we talk about Narcan nasal spray or now Cloxato, it's very easy. You open the package, put the nozzle in the nose and press the button. There's not much more to it than that. Despite it being very, very, very easy, it is not a substitute for emergency medical care. Somebody who has overdosed on opioids needs follow-up care. They can slip back into an overdose if the naloxone wears off. They can have some withdrawal symptoms that need to be treated. We really want to make sure, even if they wake up and they seem okay, that they get that next step of care. It's also a really good opportunity to kind of connect with that person and see what else they need beyond the emergency situation. So that's kind of the medical model of how naloxone works. Next question is sort of, does distributing naloxone work to help prevent overdose deaths in an individual and a community? We talk about overdose education and naloxone distribution programs, and we abbreviate that OEND. And we have a lot of evidence that these OEND programs work. So we know that a bystander administering naloxone during an overdose is going to significantly increase the chance that the person survives compared to just waiting for EMS to come and deliver naloxone at that point. We also know that on a community level that the more naloxone we can get into a community, the lower the death rate is going to be from opioid overdoses. So Massachusetts did this really neat study several years ago now, when they started implementing overdose education and naloxone distribution programs in communities. And they looked at communities that didn't have any enrollment in their programs and saw that overdose deaths went up. And then the ones that did have enrollment in their programs, overdose deaths went down. And you can see that the more enrollment, the more they dropped. So we know it works on an individual level, and we know that it works on a community level to help save lives. Because we've got all this great research, almost every medical healthcare organization in the country and even in the world has said naloxone is important. Naloxone needs to be in the hands of almost everyone. So the US Department of Health and Human Services, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, CDC, FDA have all put out statements saying how important naloxone is. This is one that I like in particular. The Surgeon General in 2018, it's Jerome Adams, issued an advisory on naloxone, and you can read it here. You know, he kind of said for people taking opioids for pain, for people misusing opioids, for healthcare practitioners, family and friends, and community members who come in contact with people at risk for opioid overdose, knowing how to use naloxone and keeping it within reach can save a life. So when he issued this, he went on kind of a media tour, and we'll just listen to a short clip, assuming that this is going to work. Hang on. Sure, I shared sound. Now we'll see if it works. Here's a clip. So I hope you all were able to hear that. He said we want it to be like an EpiPen or doing CPR on someone. He really put this in the context of basic first aid, basic public health. So we have some myths and facts that we want to talk about, but first I'm going to check in with Carrie to see if we had any questions or if there's anything anybody wants to ask before we dive into this section, and then also to bring kind of our panelists back in.
No questions have been submitted yet. We did have one question that was asked beforehand, and that question was, how many times can you give a person naloxone?
How many times in an individual emergency?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can keep giving doses until the person is awake and able to respond. They're probably going to stop you once they wake up. We caution that you want to wait 2 to 3 minutes between each dose because it does take a little while, especially with the nasal spray. It's got to get into the nasal cavity and get absorbed, get into the brain, and kind of work on those receptors. So we just want to wait and see if it's working. We don't want to like slam the person with 5 doses all at once, but if you have them on hand, you can keep going until the person is awake.
Thanks, Monica. And I think that there's one raised hand. If that person wants to ask a question, feel free.
Oh, thank you, Carrie. It's Chris Nordloh. I was just starting to type out my question, but you beat me to it, so thanks. My question is, what was the clinical reason for the new product that's awaiting FDA approval that has more milligram dose than Narcan currently? If you're able to answer that, that was interesting to me.
Yeah, so I think this is a response to seeing a lot of fentanyl overdoses because fentanyl is such a potent opioid. I think there is a concern that we're seeing more and more people requiring multiple doses to be reversed. So I suspect that was kind of the thinking behind the higher dose. We've actually done this once before too. The old dose there was a 2 milligram dose for a while, and they kind of decided 4 was a better point, but we don't really, everybody is a little bit different, and every person and every overdose is going to be a little bit different in terms of how much naloxone is needed. So there is currently a lot of debate about what do we do now that we have 2 doses? Who do we give what dose to?
Yeah, thank you. The practical issue from my vantage point sometimes is a lot of times folks that are arrested and brought to the hospital for clear for jail before they're detained. I guess there's a standard that there's going to be a 2-hour observation on a typical dose administration of Narcan. And I'm wondering if this new product with a higher dose might affect that wait time before they clear for jail, just to make sure the respiratory functions resume normally.
Yeah, I think probably the wait time will remain the same, because I would still want to keep an eye. 2 hours is about how long it takes for naloxone to wear off, regardless of the dose. So, I mean, if it were me, I would still want to watch the person and make sure that, you know, they had cleared all the opioids when the naloxone wears off, that they're not going to suddenly, you know, conk out on you again when they're away from medical services.
Yeah, thank you. That's good information. I did not realize there was a new product on the way. Do you anticipate when that might be out on the market?
They have told us they're going to start taking orders the first week in August. So I assume that means they've manufactured some of it anyway.
All right,
So we
great.
should
Thank
see
you.
it soon.
Thank you.
Great question. Any other questions before we move on to the myths and facts section? All right, let's keep going, Monica.
All right, so I'll present each myth and then we'll kind of pause and see if anybody wants to throw anything else in or has any questions. So the first myth is that naloxone encourages drug use. And this is something we hear a lot, that if people have kind of this safety net, they might use more or more recklessly or more often, and that this is kind of enabling drug use. And we have lots of studies on this, or several studies, I should say, that have found no associated increase in opioid use in people who receive take-home naloxone. So giving them that dose of naloxone doesn't change their behavior. In fact, some studies have shown that participating in an OEND program is associated with decreased drug use and an increase in treatment. So in one study, participants who had participated in the OEND program and gotten the dose of naloxone, 36% of them were in treatment at a 3-month follow-up after that encounter, compared to just 22% of people who did not participate in the OEND program. So there's a lot of, we can speculate a lot on why these reasons might be for people getting into treatment as a result of an OEND program. But really the fact is that naloxone does not encourage drug use. It just keeps people alive when they are using drugs and something goes wrong. Does anybody have any questions, or any of our other panelists want to weigh in? Chat here. Right, then I will move on to our next myth, which is that naloxone is a controlled substance. So again, this is kind of the idea that naloxone is hard to get, or that having naloxone might be a sign of some kind of misbehavior or criminal activity. And this one is pretty easy to dispel just by understanding sort of where it falls in our regulatory framework for drugs. We have our Schedule I controlled substances, which are illicit drugs like heroin and LSD. And then we have kind of 2 categories of prescription drugs, controlled substances like opioids and stimulants used for ADHD. Things like Ambien and Xanax kind of fall in this controlled substance category. And then we have what we call legend drugs, which are all the other drugs, your antibiotics and insulin and blood pressure medicine. And you can see that naloxone is legally a legend drug. I broke it out here in this chart because states have really made an effort, given its safety and importance to public health, to move this sort of practically out of this legend drug category and more into our non-prescription behind the counter category. So every state in the country now has passed some kind of regulation that makes naloxone easier to access than a traditional go to the doctor, get a prescription, take it to the pharmacy, get it filled. There is some access point in the community pharmacy for naloxone in every state. Here in Kentucky, we have a state law that allows certified pharmacists to dispense naloxone under a physician-approved protocol, which basically just means that a doctor says anybody that walks into your pharmacy, if you train them, teach them how to use naloxone, respond to an overdose, you can write a prescription essentially for that person in the physician's name. So that means that the patient can come in and does not have to present a prescription to receive the training and the naloxone. So this is something in Kentucky that pharmacies have to opt into. So not every single pharmacy in the state does it. However, many pharmacies now, you can just walk up to the counter, ask for a dose of naloxone. They're going to go through some training and some education, and then you'll be able to pay for that naloxone and take it home without ever seeing a prescriber. This law also lets pharmacies dispense to a person or an agency operating a harm reduction program. So this allows us to give a case of naloxone to a health department or a jail or some other kind of program, and that organization can then distribute the naloxone to individuals. So it lets us dispense kind of without that one-to-one provider patient pharmacist relationship. Does anybody have any questions about this? Or questions about how to get a dose of naloxone?
Monica, could you share how much naloxone costs? And then also, if a person's interested in getting naloxone, where can they find information about which pharmacies might carry it?
Yeah, so the cost question is a big one. The cash price in most pharmacies is around $130, $120, $130 for that 2-pack Narcan nasal spray. But that said, there is insurance coverage. So if you are covered on Medicaid, it's no charge. Medicare covers it with a copay. And then obviously the private insurers vary based on what the copays are. So the price that you pay at the pharmacy would vary based on your insurance coverage, basically. There are also programs, especially in our healing community studies, counties now that are distributing it for free, kind of under this harm reduction program. So if you really can't afford it at the pharmacy, hopefully your health department or somebody in your community can kind of point you to where a free dose of naloxone would be available. And then I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question.
Any websites that have information about where pharmacy?
Yeah, so in the healing community study counties, healtogetherky.org is our website that can hopefully point you to the direction of some of our no charge pharmacies and organizations. There's also stopoverdosesky.ky.gov, which has a map where you can find pharmacies that are registered and certified to do the naloxone dispensing.
And those are being put in the chat right now. Thank you. And we also have another question from an audience member that says, if a health department is getting naloxone from the pharmacy to distribute under harm reduction programs, is there a cost for the health department?
It depends on how it's set up. So sometimes they have grant funding that they can use to buy it. The manufacturer of Narcan nasal spray has a program that offers it at a cheaper price for things like health departments than it does to the pharmacy. So they can get it a little bit cheaper if they're purchasing it. But yeah, somebody somewhere has to pay for it. But most of the health departments are distributing it at no charge to the people coming in.
Thank you. Other questions?
Okay, so we'll go to the next one. I think this one might get people talking a little bit. This is the myth that naloxone rescue makes people angry or violent. This is something that feel like when I train someone, someone always says, oh, I've heard they come up swinging, or I hear people are mad when you reverse an overdose. And the first thing that we should understand in the facts are naloxone itself can't evoke violent behavior. And this should be obvious based on knowing how it works, right? It's not a stimulant. It doesn't actually have any pharmaceutical effect in and of itself. It's just undoing what the opioids were doing. That said, when we undo what the opioids were doing, for somebody who is physically dependent on opioids, we can cause some withdrawal symptoms. So it's not guaranteed that the person's going to experience withdrawal symptoms, but if they do, it's likely to be uncomfortable, disorienting. Obviously, this person is kind of coming back from almost dying, so that would be an unpleasant experience for most people. They might be unaware of what's going on or caught up in the moment and kind of in their own disorienting panic themselves. So that would potentially make somebody respond negatively. We also have some studies on naloxone rescue and sort of how people react and the circumstances around it. And in one study, they followed up with people who had participated in an OEND program to see if the doses had been used. And if they had been used, they got the whole story, kind of everything that they could collect about what happened in that circumstance. And then they compared the stories and looked at more than 10 variables that they thought might account for the person being angry when they were revived with naloxone. So they looked at what drug did the person take? Was the person upset about losing money or drugs as a result of the overdose? Did the rescuer know the person, or was it a stranger? What kind of training had the rescuer received? And of all these things that they looked at, the one variable that was strongly associated with anger was the positive or negative communication style of the rescuer. So if the rescuer said, hey, you're going to be okay, remained cool and calm and said, help is on its way, you just overdosed, you're going to be fine, that was much more likely to result in not having the person just demonstrate anger. If the rescuer berated the person, yelled at the person, kind of created this chaos, it was more likely to cause anger in the person or to result in anger in the person being rescued. So I think this is a really important point, is that circumstances matter and the way we behave matters. I completely understand that somebody might be angry and irritated when they have to save someone's life. If somebody I cared about overdosed, I'd be mad at them too. But just kind of remembering that if we can stay cool and calm and collected in the moment, that's going to improve the circumstances for everybody involved. So that is our myth on rescue makes people angry or violent. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this one?
Monica, I think this is such a relevant myth to address in criminal justice settings. And maybe Kyle, would you mind to speak on your experience with this myth?
Yeah, I raised my hand there. I think it disappeared, but my experience with using Narcan in overdose settings is it's typically not the overdose that's making them upset. It's the other drugs that may possibly be in their system, such as uppers, cocaine, methamphetamines, things of that nature. But you answered my question twofold, is that a lot of times when they're coming out of withdrawal is the worst day for these people. And they're going to be upset because they're withdrawing at that point. Narcan at that point takes away their high that they either paid their money for or that they were experiencing at the time. And you've just took that away from them. So they're not necessarily that Narcan or naloxone makes them angry or violent. It's what we took away from them that makes them angry and violent. And going back to being calm, cool, and collected, there's ways to go about it. And I think that, we have to show compassion. That's number one. I mean, it's human decency. We have to show compassion where compassion is needed. And when someone is overdosing, that is their worst moment at that moment. So being calm, cool, and collected, and making sure that these people have the space that they need to counteract their overdose. That's all I had.
Thank you. We've had a few other questions come up, but do others have questions related to this myth? Maybe from a law enforcement perspective or EMS? So one comment that came up in the chat is from Jason Merrick at Kenton County Detention Center. Jason, would you mind to ask your question or share your experience here?
Sure, thanks. And this is more of a policy, and it was a couple slides ago, but I think it's still worth mentioning, is that first responder agencies have written policy on the amounts that they can administer to every patient, so they can't go over a certain number of dosages or a certain milligram of medicine per patient. And so, and what we found is that this creates barriers to distribution. And an example would be that, say I approach an agency to wanting to give them Narcan to help, and they say, no, our regulations state that we can only use the 0.2 mg to ml formulation. And they're not even able to accept donations or like the nasal Narcan units that we've all been using. They can't even take those because they're still using the Nordloh version, the 0.2 mg to ml version that was years, seems like decades ago, but just several years back. And so, and I found that we found that sometimes these policies are really difficult to change, unwilling, unable to make the modifications. And then so when you look at, they're only allowed to give like 6 milligram doses per patient, and the formulation that we want to give them is 4 milligram per ml. And so the math just doesn't make sense there. And it's sometimes a little frustrating to try to support local EMS when they can't accept the donations because of just a simple policy shift. So just something to consider when we, when we're looking out and trying to support our local EMS and first responders with some, perhaps, with the life-saving medicine.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Those policies, I think we all do it. We did it on the Healing Community study with Narcan nasal spray. We put Narcan nasal spray with the NDC and the 4 milligrams in our standing order agreements. And here we are with Kloxxado, we're going to have to update it if we decide to start using it. So, I think that's an important lesson, that if you're working on a policy, to remember to build in those kind of flexibilities for as this epidemic and crisis kind of changes and the market changes, that, we need to stay on our feet and make sure we're reaching everybody.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jason. I'm glad you brought it up. What we've done within our detention center, we instead of painting ourselves into a corner, under Jailer Tessie's guidance, not only did we just have policy and procedure that were set in stone, now we have generated policy, or not necessarily policy, but SOGs, a guideline that we can go by that can be bent and molded into the situation at hand. It's difficult to continue to try to do good whenever you've painted yourself into a corner with policies that you can't go over. But at the same time, policies are policy. Your department can make those policies. Your department can then undo said policies. So I know where you're at, Jason, and it is very difficult.
I think this is an important issue, and that the HEAL project is tracking policy barriers, and we're trying to work with state partners to address some of those policy barriers. And April Young from our team said that she will track this, and we will try to work on addressing this. And we have wonderful people like Monica Roberts, who are academic detailing pharmacists, who can educate individuals about the importance of the different formulations. Monica, there was one other question that was about the shelf life of naloxone. If you could.
Yeah, so this has changed a little bit over the years too. The current ones that are being manufactured have an expiration date that is usually 36 months after its manufacture, so about 3 years. We recommend replacing your dose when it has an expired date on it. That said, we know expired naloxone still works much of the time. It doesn't go bad. It's not going to suddenly be a harmful drug. It might just not work as well. So it might lose its effectiveness over time as we get out past that expiration date. So we always say if all you have is expired naloxone, that's better than no naloxone. But generally, we want to replace it every 3 years if we luckily haven't used it. Some of the older doses only have like 18 months or 24 months. They keep kind of doing the studies to extend that date out. So if you have some sitting in a closet, check out the dates to make sure that they're still good.
And we're hearing other people who are echoing the 0.2 milligram formulation in first responders, and that the main policy barrier is stigma. So maybe I could interject here because stigma is such a big issue. And if we could get the panelists' perspective about what the corrections field can do to help reduce stigma. If Kyle or Chris want to respond to that.
Yeah. Chris, you got the letters before your name. You want to go first, sir?
Yes. I think from a policy standpoint for the counties and statewide is we realize that addiction fiscally is very expensive. Oftentimes, our inmate population from a pretrial detainee standpoint, I think statistically it would be safe to say upwards of 80% have problems stemming from addiction. So addressing it and helping the root cause of why these folks are coming back into the system is way more productive from a compassionate standpoint and correction standpoint, but it also makes fiscal sense for the policymakers and the elected officials who have constituents who are very mindful of budgets. So to that end, I know Kenton County in the detention center has devoted resources, including hiring and allowing Jason Merrick as the Director of Addiction Services to provide excellent knowledge and resources to our inmate population and community-wide. And in addition to that effort, there's been efforts by the county police department that when an officer administers Narcan in the field, there is an immediate response to that individual's residence by someone who's trained, and not necessarily a clinician, but someone that is able to go to that person and provide information about resources available to that individual. So we recognize that we are dealing with addiction illness and that we cannot incarcerate our way out of the problem. So those are just two of the things that have been going on in this county that I know have been very effective and well received.
And it's not just Madison County. It's not just Kenton County. It's not, we have 120 counties in Kentucky, and every one of the counties are dealing with the same issue as we are. And addiction is not broad stroke. One thing is going to fix all the problems. We have to get to the root causation of addiction, and that's individual. Every person has the reason why they're addicted. So we have to get to the root causation of the addiction. But at the same time, going back to naloxone distribution from a jail standpoint is not necessarily, the stigma of it is bad. We're enabling these people to continue to use drugs. Well, this goes back to the previous question of a success story. What I've responded to an overdose One of my individuals was on home incarceration. His monitor on his ankle hadn't moved in a period of time. And I responded due to the non-movement of his ankle monitor. When I got to his house, his door was ajar. I knocked on the door, and an individual was sitting, the door opened, and an individual was sitting across the way. And I said, "Hey, where's so-and-so at?" And he said, "He's right there." And I look over, and this is a very tall gentleman. This gentleman is in like a folding camping chair, doubled over with his neck backwards. He's that gray ashy color. He looked dead. When I shook him to get him to come to, and he just had that ragged, raspy breath. This person was actively in an overdose, and somebody that was sitting roughly 3 foot away from him had no idea nor cared. And I drove roughly 15 miles to go check on him to make sure he was okay. I used an entire box of naloxone, the Narcan nasal spray that I did not have on me. Thankfully, this person knew that he was in addiction and knew that he had a problem and came across Narcan from either a harm reduction program, got it from another jail, wherever he got it from, I don't care. He had it that night. And luckily I was trained and knew how to use Narcan, administered both units of Narcan to him, and it saved his life. He's free today to commit as many felonies as he wishes. He's out of jail doing whatever he wants to do, but at least he's alive. And maybe one of these days he will choose to get clean. That's all on people like on this panel, people that are joined in because they care. Somebody cared enough to give this gentleman Narcan, and I cared enough or was employed enough to respond to what I've deemed an emergency, and he had it on him. Had he not, who's to say that he'd be here today? But the stigma is that we're just going to give them Narcan to go out and use again. They're going to use regardless. Whatever we do, they're going to continue to use because we yet to get to the root causation of the addiction. But once we can find the root causation of one's addiction, we can fix that one problem. And then we have that return on investment. We can get that recidivism rate down so they don't continue coming back to jail.
Thank you, Major Barrett. That is a really powerful story that you shared. I mean, I think it goes back to the other myth that naloxone increases drug use, and that's not necessarily true. If we don't save someone's life, they have no opportunity to get treatment. And so this is a first step to addressing stigma, is making sure that we can get naloxone into people's hands and make sure that they're trained to be able to use it in an overdose event. Other comments from our panelists or our audience? All right, we'll go back to you, Monica.
All right, so we'll do our last myth. There we go. And this is that individuals are held liable for distributing or administering naloxone. So this is a common fear we hear. What if I have naloxone and something goes wrong? It doesn't work, or there's a bad outcome, or something happens to the person that overdoses. Can I be sued or arrested? What is my risk by trying to save somebody's life here? And again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a pharmacist, but I can tell you what the statute says, and then hopefully Chris can weigh in as well. The statute in Kentucky says that a person acting in good faith who administers naloxone shall be immune from criminal and civil liability for the administration, unless the bad outcome results from gross negligence or willful or wanton misconduct. So this is really an area where our Kentucky legislature has said naloxone is so important and such a crucial piece of this public health puzzle that we're going to protect people who try to use it. We're going to make sure that people who do the right thing are protected from that liability. So far from being held liable, you're actually specifically immune from liability. We also have protection in this law for the prescriber and the pharmacist to participate in the distribution of the naloxone, so they don't face malpractice suits or punishment from their boards if they administer or distribute naloxone. So we have this very specific statute that says, you are not going to be held liable for administering naloxone. I won't get too deep into the Good Samaritan law, but we also have a Good Samaritan law here in Kentucky that offers protection for prosecution from specifically possession of controlled substances and possession of drug paraphernalia if certain criteria are met when you call for help for an overdose. So this is just another area where our legislature has said this is that important that we want to make sure people feel comfortable doing it and have some protection when they try to help somebody who's in an overdose. So with that, I will turn it back over.
So Chris, we have lots of audience questions here, I think, that are best addressed to you. And so the first question is, if a first responder has naloxone on their person as part of their job duties, and they choose not to administer naloxone to a person who's overdosed, are they legally responsible for the person's death, criminally or civilly? I don't know if you have any case law to share on that or perspective that would be helpful.
Sure. This might surprise many folks in the audience, but currently under federal and state law, there is no affirmative duty to administer aid. And I have not seen any specific case that would create an exception even for Narcan administration. The only exception to that is if there's a special relationship that exists between the person who is in need of the Narcan and the state actor, whether it be a law enforcement officer or a deputy jailer or medical personnel employed by the county. And that if there's a special relationship, which I guess is most easily defined as if they're in custody and otherwise able to help themselves or seek assistance, then there is a duty created under both the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution on due process grounds and also under state law, under what the state refers to as the public duty doctrine. But at bottom, there is no affirmative duty to administer naloxone absent that special relationship or circumstances that would cause the public duty doctrine to apply.
Thank you. I think that's a legal perspective. I think from a public health perspective, we want to encourage people to respond to overdose events. And it's, I'm sure that, Major Barrett, that experience that you had will stay with you for forever and has a powerful impact on your life, but also on the person that you saved. And it gives people a chance to get into treatment if that's what they choose, or to reduce their risk if they continue using drugs.
I saw that gentleman just maybe 2 days ago, 3 days ago. He come up and asked me if I had a lighter so he can light a cigarette. Never said thank you, never said, hey, you saved my life. And I just said, hey, whenever you're ready to get clean, just let me know. And he just blew it off and took off walking after he lit a cigarette. It's just, it is what it is. And what we do as humans is, and people that are in public safety and people that are in public health or whatever, we chose the profession for a reason. We're here to try to help people, or if our actions or our stories can change one person's life, then I feel like we've done our job. And I done my job that night, and he has to do his. He has to make that determination on when he's ready to get clean.
Yeah, I will just footnote that real quickly. I think the legislature has signaled very clearly the statewide policy that they want intervention when at all practically possible by the passage of KRS 217-186. It's up at least on my screen. I don't know if everyone can still see it, but that immunity from civil and criminal liability for intervention is pretty clear. that they want people to assist whenever possible. And I can't conceive of any circumstance, nor have I seen it, from the prescription side, the distribution side, or administration side, where there's been any attempt to impose either civil or criminal liability for someone's intervention, whether it's a state actor or just a Good Samaritan civilian. So aside from the black letter law, which is the current state of the law, that there's no affirmative duty to intervene, I think the public policy pendulum is swinging in the direction of help if you can.
Thank you. Another question is related to this, and the audience member was asking if they intervene in an overdose event, what happens when an EMT arrives to assist the person? Is that person who administers the naloxone as a bystander? Are they required to answer questions if police come onto the scene? Can they leave? You know, are there limitations to the Good Samaritan law? They wanted to know what happens after they administer the naloxone.
Carrie, did you want me to field that?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Well, I think that the public policy is render aid if you can and call for help if you can't. And they are giving civil and criminal immunity from liability for people who call for help or attempt to help. And the statute 218A 133, which is, I know I understand with just a bunch of numbers for most folks in the audience, but it gives immunity not only from prosecution, but even being charged. So law enforcement shouldn't really even charge someone who in good faith has sought medical assistance for someone who they objectively believe has overdosed on drugs. There are some criteria for that immunity to apply, and that is that they request medical assistance for him or herself or another person. And I'm going to paraphrase a little bit just for time, but that they remain with the individual who appears to be experiencing the drug overdose. Now, what's interesting is there was a case decided just in 2020 by the Kentucky Court of Appeals that held that the person who had called 911 did not have to be with the person who needed the assistance when first responders arrived, because the person seeking the immunity was the person who had in fact overdosed. And notwithstanding the fact that the caller had left, probably for fear of prosecution, or maybe they had an outstanding warrant, who knows? They just didn't stick around. And the court ruled that despite the fact that the caller left, since the person who was seeking the immunity was the person that was in need of aid, that person was not charged, the person who had in fact overdosed. So, sometimes the strict language of the statute gets interpreted or applied factually for different reasons. But I was surprised to see that case while preparing for this presentation, because if you'd had asked me before I started looking if the person who called was required to stay with the individual for whom they sought care, my answer would have been yes, just based on the plain language of the statute. But it got applied differently in 2020. And I don't know if there's anybody out there that likes to look at this or read it, but the case is Logston versus Commonwealth. And there's a case site of 601 Southwest 3rd 477. And that's a Kentucky Court of Appeals opinion in 2020. So it was interesting to me to see that case.
Any other questions about legal issues surrounding naloxone administration?
Carrie, I would just add there from a healthcare standpoint, what we would ask somebody who administers naloxone to do is stay until somebody with the next level of care is there, and you can kind of pass off and say, here's what happened. If the EMS says, all right, we got it, you're good to go. You don't have to go to the hospital. You don't have to you don't have to stay with the person forever. But if there's another person there who can continue the care, that's what we would ask you to do in the ideal circumstance. I realize that is not always possible, So in those situations, we say, do what you can, give the naloxone, call 911, and if you have to leave, leave. There's no, to get that protection, you need to stay. But from a healthcare standpoint, we want you to do whatever you can, and not get hung up in what's the next thing that happens here.
Thank you for clarifying. Chris, it's been asked if you would put that case into the chat so people can access the case number, please.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. I'll be happy to do that. Well, probably while I'm answering the next question or before we leave here today, I'll post the citation for any case I cite before the conclusion. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
And I see that Ron has his hand raised. Would you mind to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. This is again referencing the liability issue. I had heard recently there was a concern expressed by an employer where there had been an offer made to train staff in the use of and administration of Narcan, and the employer expressed a concern about liability if they had staff who had been trained, had access to the Narcan, and for whatever reason did not utilize it. There was a concern that they would be held liable. That's real.
Yeah, I know these things sometimes require a lot more context, but let me just answer it like this from 30,000 foot view. I don't think so, because the statute goes out of its way to prevent civil liability unless there's a showing of gross negligence or willful or wanton misconduct. So I think that would be a very, very difficult burden to show when you have an employer who's taking the initiative in good faith to train employees to do the right thing. And I can tell you, if there's no affirmative duty for law enforcement, absent a special relationship to render aid, there's not going to be any greater duty on laypersons to do it. So if I was advising that employer, I would say, go ahead and proceed with your program in good faith, do the best you can, and not worry about civil exposure for doing that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question for Chris is if having naloxone in someone's car is a justification to search their vehicle.
Oh, that's a great question. That falls under the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure law. And I would say that alone, that fact alone would not give rise to probable cause for a search of a vehicle. If there was other indicia of criminal activity that the officer could point to or cite, collectively, it could get to the level of probable cause for a search. But just the presence of naloxone alone, given the fact that a lot of folks carry that for Good Samaritan purposes and are allowed to do so, I would think that if there's a search based solely on that fact of plain view Narcan in a vehicle, I would think there's a strong likelihood that a court would suppress any evidence found as a result of that search.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what Chris said. I would say probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, having something like Narcan in your car would definitely spark the interest of a beat cop. But now Narcan and naloxone is so readily available, it's like aspirin. I mean, somebody comes to jail with a backpack, I can guarantee you at booking process, about 75% I'm going to find Narcan in their bag. So I think Chris nailed it on the head on that one.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess it aligns with the stigma issue though. And especially if someone gets naloxone at a health department through a syringe service program, and they might be targeted by law enforcement leaving the facility. And that's been expressed as a concern among some of our partners in the HEAL project.
I think a big part of the stigma is, and I don't know, I may be speaking out of turn here, but I get to see inmates every day. Every day of my career, I see inmates, and these are people on the street. You see them every day. You just don't know that they're inmates. You know, tomorrow they're going to get arrested because they had a little bit of meth or heroin in their pocket. They're coming to jail. Within that community, within that the community of drug addiction, they live a certain lifestyle. Within that lifestyle, it is okay to have Narcan. It is okay to use Narcan. But if you just take 2 steps and start getting clean, you morph into a different lifestyle where everything and anything that you do is scrutinized by normal people. And I think that's where we're at right now is that should we use Narcan? Should we not use Narcan? And the people that need the Narcan carry it every day. Why can't the people that could assist start carrying it every day?
So this is a question for you, Major Barrett, but what do jails think of overdose education and naloxone distribution? What's their view on it?
At the beginning, I would be right on board. Why would we enable these people? We're just giving them something else to use when they get out of jail. And as I've educated myself on it, I have become aware that people are going to use regardless. If we can give them the world, I can rope the moon and give it to them, they're still going to use. Somebody that is an active addiction, it does not matter what you give them, they're going to use. Giving them a box of Narcan on the way out the door. Hey, please don't use, but if you do, here's this. So within the confines of the jail, we have it on the wall. We have it on our deputies' belts. Within our facility, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but looking at constituents looking in that maybe don't know the full realm of possibilities, that's one avenue to save someone's life. That's if we had it earlier within our facility, maybe I would have been handed 5 boxes that night that I needed it, instead of somebody having to rummage around and find 1 box. Thank the good Lord above that there was somebody that was able to give me Narcan to assist this guy. If I have the ability to save someone's life, how can you say no? I'm a very large man, and I go down in a restaurant because I've chose to eat cheeseburgers and French fries my entire life, and I'm having a heart attack because of that. Does my weight constitute not being able to give me CPR because I've chose bad decisions in my life? It's the exact same. Because someone chose bad decisions and chose to use Narcan or chose to use heroin, how do we get to dictate, no, I'm not using Narcan on him?
Yeah. I think that from a public health perspective, if we come upon an overdose event, it would be best practice to try to address it and save someone's life. I think that you're saying that there's a lot of naloxone out there in our communities, but from our work with the HEAL, some of our partner agencies don't have any naloxone and haven't had any access, or maybe they have it for staff, but for people who are served by the agencies, they have no access to naloxone. And so kind of giving that perspective for all 3 of our panelists, who do you think should carry naloxone?
Everyone.
Monica?
Everyone.
Chris, there might be peer pressure here. What's your answer?
No, I was just trained and have some in my possession. So I would feel competent to administer if the occasion arose. And there's never anything wrong with being prepared.
Well, thank you all. I think that it sounds like it, from everyone's perspective, from a legal perspective, a pharmacy perspective, a corrections perspective, is that naloxone's needed in our communities and it's useful for everyone to carry. We have another question for Chris, and I welcome people to put more comments into the chat. But this question for Chris asks, from your perspective in the county attorney's office, where are there opportunities for law enforcement and criminal justice professionals to partner with public health to engage communities in fighting overdose deaths? So where can counties attorneys?
Well, I think the initiative that we're talking about today is not only a good, but maybe the best example, because there is a concerted effort on multiple levels of local government to make sure that Narcan is being distributed to agency partners like the Kenton County Detention Center and all the jails statewide, that folks within the detention facility feel comfortable and competent to administer it if the need would arise at intake, or even with someone in custody if someone brought in contraband. And then there is also an effort through this collaboration to make sure that inmates at release are appropriately receiving Narcan through, in our case here in Kenton County, we use our medical contractor, Southern Health Partners, as the physician to distribute that to inmates who qualify. Jason Merrick would be better able to talk about the qualifications and that protocol. But this is the best real life example of joint efforts being made at multiple levels of government to address a problem.
Well, thank you for saying that. That I think makes us feel good, and I'm glad that we're receiving positive feedback from community partners about times where people have used the naloxone that they've received as part of the HEAL project to save a life. And so we're glad to have that opportunity. But I do want to ask the panelists about what other opportunities are there to educate law enforcement or justice partners who may be a little bit hesitant to use Narcan? Like, what can we do to convince those law enforcement agencies or those justice partners?
For me, it took being in the middle of it and realizing, I really need to, I need this stuff. I need trained on how to use this stuff. You know, when you're smack dab in the middle of an emergency where somebody's overdosing, that is a big eye opener at that point.
Monica or Chris, other thoughts about how we can educate law enforcement agencies or justice partners to convince them the importance of having naloxone on hand and administering it?
I mean, I think just trying to make it as easy as possible, right? Like low barriers. They don't have to sign up for something. We're just going to show up there and talk to them, or, you know, we're going to make it easy for them to get their hands on naloxone. I know when we first started talking to our communities, a lot of them said, we can't afford to put this in our jail, or we can't afford to have our EMS carry, you know, pass it out to people. And so just, you know, trying to break down any of those extra excuses that people have to make it, you know, just right in their face and easy to do is the best we can hope for. You know, Sharon always says changing hearts and minds, and that's a lot harder to do. But if you can take out the practical barriers, you're just that much closer to their hearts and minds to get them on board.
And I will follow up with that, you know, most of the phone calls and questions I address is, should we do this? What's our exposure from a liability standpoint? And the easiest thing to tell folks who have questions about administering Narcan is, most often you can't be sued. And if you are, it will be dismissed on immunity grounds. So that should give every official, whether elected or appointed, or anybody that's able to help, should give them great reassurance that they can do so risk-free, individually and for their employer. That can rarely ever be said in this line of work. But here the legislature has made it clear, help if you can, and we're going to give you blanket immunity if you do.
I think that's a really important point, and it comes up a lot with in our discussions with agencies. I have one additional practical question, and that is for agencies that are distributing naloxone through the HEAL project. This question is for Monica. They want to know, how many times can you get naloxone through the HEAL project? Can you get it more than once?
Like an individual, if they
Yes,
are
if they
coming
use
back
it.
to get more, yep,
Mhm.
they can get it as often as they need it. We're not going to send you away with 5 at a time, but if you take one and you come back a week later and said, I used it, they can have another one. So if they're being used, we want to make sure that more is getting out there. So that one's easy.
Thank you. Audience members, do you have any last minute burning questions? Because we're running out of time here. I don't see any hands raised.
Carrie, this is Brooke Hiltz. I have a question if we have a
Sure.
second. So along the lines of what has been shared, and Chris, I really appreciate it. I'm the community coordinator here in Kenton County and appreciate all the amazing efforts we have here. I think that some of the pushback though we get from police departments is, well, we're just not sure, or the EMS has it, so as long as they get there in 7 to 10 minutes, it's okay. So I'm just curious, within the role of a county attorney's office, you know, how can police departments within the county be encouraged to carry, or I just don't know exactly what the framework is to say to them, the county, you know, the county attorney says it's okay. And so you should take this free Narcan, and every police officer should have it in their car. Because I feel like Kenton County is progressive, but we still have so much resistance to that.
Well, you know, what's interesting at the beginning of this presentation, I noticed the disclaimer that nothing is intended to be legal advice. And outside of presentations, I say that jokingly, but outside of these presentations, that disclaimer never applies. So in Kenton County, where there's so many different jurisdictions, I mean, we county government, and then there's 19 other policing agencies, each with their own elected mayors and appointed police chiefs. So there is a lot going on within the county, and working in county government, we only advise county officials, even though many things are through interlocal and by agreement. But to answer your question, I think, and my involvement is strictly at the county level, and we do help other policing agencies and jurisdictions with general advice, but all of them have their own separate legal counsel. Most do. They rely on us a lot, but when it comes time to make policy decisions about budgets and what equipment police officers carry, whether they carry Narcan or they don't, those are made independent of us. And while we can share our experiences and the successes we've had at the county level with promoting Narcan, its use, its distribution, and administering it whenever possible, it is still up to each of the agencies to make that decision. Now, having said that, through our office comes the decision of whether to prosecute cases at the misdemeanor level, at least, which is crimes carrying $1,000 fine or less, or up to a year in jail. So if someone came to our office wanting to prosecute a case that would fall within one of these immunity exceptions or something, our office would have discretion on whether or not to take that case. And I think most agencies in Kenton County understand our position that we advocate rendering aid, and we will always be in a position to be supportive of other agencies that make that effort. And while no outcome is ever guaranteed, and we can never stop someone from filing a lawsuit, we feel very comfortable in defending the merits of programs that follow the signal of the legislature of help when you're able, without fear of civil and criminal liability. So we can say it a lot, we can advocate it, and we can practice what we preach, but each of these agencies with their own political structures within a county, they have to be willing to make those decisions on their own. But I think, our Judge Executive, Judge Knockelman, has done a wonderful job with communication efforts and outreach that anybody in Kenton County at the city level should feel very, very comfortable with following his lead in programs that try to mitigate the effects of the opioid pandemic.
Thank you. We have one last quick question, and then it's for Monica, and it's if school systems have naloxone available, and then we'll turn it back to Lisa to wrap us up for continuing ed credits.
Yeah, so some school systems do. Some school systems have policies about having it. Many of our school systems in Kentucky do not have a policy. In some cases where it is still legally a prescription medication, it kind of falls under their prescription medication policies, and just depends on, what their rules are with the nurses' offices and that kind of thing. So it's kind of across the board. That said, a school staff member or teacher or administrator who wanted to make sure it was around could certainly get their own prescription for it or get it themselves and keep it on themselves as an option. So that is kind of a tricky answer, but it falls in that prescription drug realm for school systems.
Thank you to all three of our wonderful panelists. I mean, I got some questions to answer that I had about naloxone, and I'm hoping that the audience did as well. Lisa, would you mind to share information about the continuing education?
Yes. So everyone should see my screen here. And what I'd like to do is just go over some of the steps of how you can receive your CE credits. There is a link here, and I just put it in the chat box. Let me send it.